Interesting introduction this morning, some issues that I'm sure will stay with us for the rest of the 6 lectures. The format this afternoon will be essentially the same as this morning. And again, of course, Bob needs no introduction, so I will just note that we will be speaking now on elaborating abilities, the expressive role of logic.
This morning, I began to set out my enterprise against the background of an understanding of the classical project of philosophical analysis as having the task of exhibiting what's expressed semantically by one vocabulary, one sort of meaning, as the logical elaboration of what's expressed by another. From this point of view, empiricism and naturalism show up as core analytic programs, with their species distinguished by the vocabularies they treat as basic and those they seek to elaborate on those bases, and in part by the sort of logically articulated elaboration they see as relating the base and target vocabularies. Pragmatism, I suggested, can be thought of as challenging these analytic undertakings by insisting that appeal to meaning is just one optional, theoretically laden way of dealing with use, and one that's based on a defective, scientistic, uniformitarian theory of what's required to understand what one has to do in order to count as saying various kinds of things, as deploying various vocabularies. But if we accept the methodological pragmatism that tells us that the point of semantic theory is to make sense of pragmatics, that meaning should be thought of as theoretical entities postulated to explain or at least codify proprieties of use, and supplement it with semantic pragmatism that tells us that only its use can explain the association of meaning with or its expression by a vocabulary, we see that we're not choosing to force between thinking in terms of meanings expressed by vocabularies and thinking in terms of their use. I want to show how pragmatism can be turned from a pessimistic, even nihilistic counsel of theoretical despair into a definite, substantive, progressive, and even promising program in the philosophy of language. Indeed, how it can be understood simply as the latest phase of the analytic project. A central task must be to get clearer about the notion of use that pragmatism seeks, ironically, to lay alongside semantics, or with which it seeks, more martially, to displace semantics. The starting place I suggested this morning is the way in which automaton theory lets us specify the abilities needed to deploy syntactically characterized vocabularies, in the sense of being able both to distinguish and to generate them. This idiom illustrated a number of basic meaning-use relations between, as I suggested we label them, vocabularies and practices or abilities. I should say parenthetically, I always say practices or abilities because I want to be neutral between thinking it's social practices that confer these meanings and thinking more individually about the abilities needed to engage in those practices or use things. My discussion began with vocabularies that are syntactically specified rather than semantically specified. And that's a restriction that pays off in clarity and definiteness of specifying the relations involved, but only at the high price of abstracting from the dimension of semantic expressiveness that makes us care philosophically about vocabularies in the first place. After all, it's meaning-use relations we're ultimately after. Nonetheless, we could see already at that point that the meta-vocabulary we use to characterize a vocabulary makes a significant difference to what sort of practices or abilities can count as deploying it. We also saw that the practices or abilities to deploy those meta-vocabularies, the ones that are, in my terms, PV sufficient for them, must be thought of in turn in terms of the vocabularies in which they are specified. I promised that we could build on this initial simplified syntactic model of basic and resultant meaning-use relations, especially PV sufficiency and VP sufficiency, the pragmatically mediated relation between vocabularies, that is their composition, and the sort of pragmatic expressive bootstrapping exhibited by such relations, even in the syntactic case, to yield insight into the corresponding relations between genuine meanings and uses for vocabularies characterized in full-blooded semantic metavocabularies. So far, though, I've talked about automata as merely syntactic engines, which is to say as sets of primitive PV-sufficient abilities to deploy purely syntactically characterized vocabularies. But there is another way to think about the abilities that the automaton-theoretic VP-sufficient vocabulary specifies. Automata put together primitive abilities so they add up to more complex ones. Automata are the practical embodiments of algorithms. And algorithms generally say how some set of primitive abilities can be so exercised as to constitute more complex abilities. For instance, an algorithm implemented by an automaton tells us how to put together the capacities to multiply and subtract so as to mount to the capacity for long division. Thought of this way, automata are defined by a definite set of meta-abilities, abilities to elaborate a set of primitive abilities into a more complex set, a set of more complex ones. In the meta-vocabulary for meaning-use relations that I'm introducing here, they implement PP sufficiency relations, the kind of relation that obtains when the capacity to engage in one sort of practice or exercise one sort of ability is in principle sufficient for the capacity to engage in other practices or exercise other abilities. Putting the point the other way around, an automaton theoretic specification of how a set of primitive practices or abilities can be algorithmically elaborated into a more complex set of practices or abilities shows how the latter can be pragmatically analyzed into the former. Semantic analysis in the most straightforward case, for instance Russell's analysis of definite descriptions, shows how some meanings can be exhibited as complex, in the sense that they can be understood as compounded by definite means out of more basic meanings. The semantic logicism characteristic of the classical project of philosophical analysis in the 20th century insists that it's logical vocabulary that articulates or makes explicit such semantic compounding. But we can lay alongside this conception a notion of pragmatic analysis. This is the analysis of some uses as complex, in the sense that they can be understood as compounded by definite means out of simpler ones, simpler uses. That is, in the regimentation I'm employing, practices or abilities. My claim is that automata can be thought of as one way, only one way, of implementing such pragmatic analyses. What thinking about automata in this broad sense will do is teach us that the algorithmic elaboration of primitive abilities into complex ones can play the same role in pragmatic analysis that logic does in semantic analysis. Algorithmic elaboration is a logic of practical abilities. My aim is to weave these two sorts of analysis together as essential elements of a more comprehensive kind of meaning use analysis. In this afternoon's lecture, I'll begin to explore what happens when we add the PP sufficiency relation of algorithmic elaboration implemented by automata to the conceptual apparatus of the PV sufficiency of practices or abilities to deploy vocabularies and the VP sufficiency of vocabularies to specify practices or abilities. Doing that is the first step in the move to understanding the practices or abilities involved in deploying semantically characterized vocabularies. Automata, in the general sense in which I want to think about them, are constellations of practices or abilities that algorithmically elaborate sets of primitive practices or abilities into more complex ones. Transducing automata generalize the primitive reading and writing abilities of finite state automata to include discriminating stimuli of any kind on the input side and differentially responding in any way on the output side. That is, instead of an alphabet of character types, tokenings of which can be indifferently read or written, these automata are defined over a pair, SR, of stimulus types and response types. The stimulus types are any circumstances to which the system is able reliably to respond differentially. The response types are any kinds of performance that can be differentially elicited from the system, that is, which it produces in some circumstances and not others. A single state transducing automaton can be specified by a state table that's just a set of pairs of stimulus kinds and kinds of responses they would elicit. It's just a set of reliable differential responsive dispositions. The stimulus response model might seem to impose a formal, narrowly behaviorist straitjacket on what counts as a primitive ability. Well, behaviorism is lurking in the vicinity, but I think it's important to see that its proximity does not arise from this characterization of primitive abilities. For how restrictive the stimulus response model of such abilities is depends on the VP sufficient vocabulary that we're allowed to use in specifying the discriminable stimuli and the differentially elicitable performances. If no restrictions are imposed, then candidate stimuli one might have the ability to discriminate could include such species as responding differentially to poetry that qualifies as lyrical, actions that are cruel, remarks that are witty or telling, historical events that illustrate the superiority of liberal political arrangements, and so on. And the responsively elistable performances could include anything had the ability to do: painting well-composed pictures, towing the party line, riding a bike, standing the right conversational distance from someone, and so on. So the practices or abilities counted as primitive, in the sense that they're regarded as inputs to the process of algorithmic elaboration, need not at all be crude, easily acquired, or something that we in principle share with lab rodents. What is crudely behavioristic about anything specifiable as a single-state transducing automaton, whether it became so specifiable by a process of learning or came that way innately, is the inflexibility of its behavior. Though it can, by definition, respond differently to different situations, it always responds the same way to the same kind of situation. Its behavior is governed by a set of reliable differential responsive dispositions. From an algorithmic point of view, the different stimulus kinds can be thought of as instructions to produce performances of the kind associated with those stimulus kinds in the state table that specifies the automaton. So, if we're in a position to produce stimuli of desired kinds at will, we can program the single-state transducing automaton to execute arbitrary straight schedule algorithms over its specified behavioral repertoire. That is, we can instruct it to do any of the things it can do to produce performances of any of the kinds in its responsive repertoire R, sequentially, in any order we like. So it can follow a list of instructions. That's one kind of practical elaboration of basic abilities into complex ones, but it's a poor one. Much greater flexibility is exhibited by finite state transducing automata. Besides responding differentially to stimuli by producing performances from its responsive repertoire, a finite state transducing automaton can respond differentially also by changing state. And that means it can combine its primitive abilities according to conditional branch schedule algorithms, which specify how it alters its differential responsive dispositions in response to the actual outcome of something it has done, for instance, its success or failure at achieving some recognizable result. These multi-state functional systems are accordingly much more capable than the corresponding single-state behavioral systems, even when they're defined over the same set of primitive discriminable situation kinds and elicitable performance kinds. The finite state ones can elaborate much more complex practices or abilities on the basis of the same primitive abilities. The advance from behaviorism to functionalism in the philosophy of mind corresponds to the move from single-state to multi-state models. I'll have more to say about functionalism in this connection later on. Transducing automata are more than merely syntactic elaborating engines because the stimuli they can respond to and the responses they can produce are not limited to symbol types. Depending on what we still might think of as an alphabet of stimulus and response kinds that they elaborate, however, they can also manipulate symbols. But they allow us to think about symbols in a new way, still not representationally, nor yet semantically, but not just syntactically either. For we can think of symbols generically as anything that can be both read and written, that is, recognized and produced. In this broad sense, anything in the intersection of S and R can be used as a symbol. A symbol is any stimulus kind, instances of which the system can produce as responses. Algorithmic elaborating abilities, paradigmatically abilities to respond differentially to stimuli by changing state, implement PP sufficiency relations between primitive abilities and more complex ones. They accordingly delineate a notion of one set of practices or abilities being in principle sufficient for another, of what it is for the elaborated practices or abilities to be practically implicit in the primitive ones from which they are algorithmically elaborated. They give a definite sense to saying that if a system has abilities A1 through AN, it already knows how to do everything it needs in principle to know how to do in order to do A. There's a kind of idealization involved in any such claim. What's required to define the basic relation of PP sufficiency is to be clear about the nature of that idealization. Not every system may in fact have the algorithmic elaborating abilities. Algorithmic PP sufficiency is what holds in case all it needs to elaborate its basic abilities into the complex ones in question is those algorithmic elaborating abilities. The automaton theoretic metavocabulary for specifying abilities that implement PP sufficiency relations typically involves further idealizations as well. These idealizations have not, as far as I can determine, been much discussed, even by computer scientists, but they are substantial and noteworthy in connection with the present enterprise. The first idealizing assumption is that any stimulus to which the system can respond differentially can be connected to any response it's capable of differentially producing. That is, there's no restriction on which elements of the stimulus set and the response set can be linked together as elements of the state table. I'll call this assumption response substitution. If a system is capable of producing some response differentially to S and can respond to some kind of stimulus by producing R's, then it's in this sense capable of responding differentially to S's by producing R's. For many actual systems, this is not at all a realistic assumption. I can respond with delight to the baby's chortle, the kitten's antics, and an unexpected glimpse of a beautiful orchid. I can distinguish disgusting smells, tastes, and sights. Could I really be trained to respond with delight to those disgusting stimuli? Well, of course, I'm not claiming I could. I'm delineating a sense of in-principle capability in which I, in principle, already have all the basic discriminative and performative abilities needed for such a responsive connection. Insofar as I cannot, in fact, responsively hook those basic abilities together in arbitrary combinations, those restrictions count, relative to the idealization, as psychological restrictions in a broad sense. In this sense, automata have no psychology. The second idealization is that the stimulus-response connections of which a system is capable, either ideally according to response substitution, or really, psychologically, can be arbitrarily combined into states. If I can respond to stimuli of kind Si with responses of kind Rj, and to stimuli of kind Sk with responses of kind Rl, and if Si and Sk are compatible, and so are Rj and Rl, then I can be in a state in which I'm disposed to respond to Si with Rj and to Sk with Rl. I'll call this idealizing assumption arbitrary state formation. Once again, failures to form state tables arbitrarily will be counted as psychological restrictions of the system, in the broad sense defined by contrast to this idealization. And the final idealization of the transducing automaton model of PP sufficiency is then arbitrary state permutation, which is arbitrary formation of state tables. If a system is capable of entering into responsive state 1 and is capable of entering into responsive state 2, defined over the stimulus response kind universe SR, then it's capable in principle in this sense of responding to stimuli of any kind in its repertoire by changing from state 1 to state 2 and vice versa. The algorithmic abilities to form states as constellations of differential responsive dispositions and to change them in response to already discriminable stimuli, together with these idealizations concerning those abilities, give a well-defined sense to the concept of one set of practices or abilities being PP sufficient for another, in the sense that the latter can be exhibited as the result of algorithmically elaborating the former, or equivalently that the latter can be algorithmically decomposed or analyzed into the latter. So far I've introduced three basic meaning-use relations and used automaton theoretic considerations to illustrate and to some extent clarify them. Those are the PV sufficiency of some practices or abilities to deploy a vocabulary, the VP sufficiency of a vocabulary to specify a set of practices or abilities, and the PP sufficiency of a set of practices or abilities that can be elaborated into another by a set of algorithmic abilities that implement the practical elaboration. I've also appealed to a fourth, the VV sufficiency of one vocabulary to characterize another. This is the familiar relation of being a direct or immediate semantic metavocabulary. This terminology lines up with the conventions I've offered for meaning-use diagrams in the way that you'll find on your handout. The meaning-use analysis terminology talks about characterizing, deploying, implementing, elaborating, and specifying. And I'll try and use those terms only in their technical senses. All of those are sufficiency relations. And now I want to say something briefly about corresponding necessity relations. This morning I mentioned one sense of pragmatic presupposition, the PP necessity relation that obtains when it's not possible to engage in or exercise one set of practices or abilities unless one also engages in or exercises another. But the sense of pragmatic presupposition I want to focus on here is PV necessity, The sense in which the capacity to say something of a certain kind, to deploy a particular vocabulary, can require being able to do something of a specifiable kind. For example, using observational vocabulary, using expressions in the observational way, making non-inferential reports, for instance of the visible presence of red things, requires being able reliably differentially to respond to stimuli of the relevant kind, for instance visible red things. That's a capacity those who can deploy such vocabularies might share with those, such as pigeons, who cannot do so. Besides asking what practical abilities are necessary in order to deploy a particular vocabulary, such as observational, logical, indexical, or normative vocabulary, we can ask whether there is some kind of thing one must be able to do in order to deploy any vocabulary whatever, no matter what it is. Are there any practical abilities that are universally PV necessary? This is a way of asking what sort of doings deserve to count as sayings. In the very general way in which I've been using the term vocabulary, many of the vocabularies of most philosophical concern are language fragments, expressions whose use is not an autonomous discursive practice, in the sense of a language game one could play though one played no other, or a set of discursive abilities one could have though one had no other specifically discursive abilities. Singular terms, for instance, constitute a vocabulary in my sense, but no one could count as using singular terms unless she could also use sentences containing them, and hence predicates as well. Vocabularies deployed by autonomous discursive practices might be called autonomous vocabularies, or just languages. In this sense, there is no language of physics, though there is a vocabulary of physics. Any vocabulary that's fragmentary, that is not autonomous, pragmatically presupposes, in the PV necessity sense, some set of autonomous discursive practices which are PV sufficient for deploying the autonomous vocabulary, of which the vocabulary in question is a fragment. If that's right, then any practices PV necessary for every autonomous vocabulary would be PV necessary for every vocabulary whatsoever. Now, it certainly can coherently be denied that there is any core of practices or abilities in this sense common to all autonomous discursive practices. Wittgenstein seems to do so in thinking of such practices as language games, Sprachspiele, given his insistence that the concept game does not have an essence or a definition, but is structured rather by family resemblances. That's why he doesn't see language as having a downtown, by more or less peripheral relation to which something else can count as linguistic. But I think that there is a relatively bright line to be drawn in the vicinity, marking a good thing to mean by linguistic, or discursive. Specifically, linguistic practices are those in which some doings have the practical significance of sayings. And the core case of saying something is making a claim, asserting something. The practices I'll call linguistic or discursive are those in which it's possible to make assertions or claims. Although, as Wittgenstein is concerned to point out, their occurrence can have other kinds of import, the home language game of what are for that very reason called declarative sentences is their freestanding use in asserting. By this assertional pragmatic criterion of demarcation of the discursive, many of Wittgenstein's Sprachspiele are not really Sprachspiele. They're vocal practices, but not genuinely verbal ones. For instance, the practices introduced in Section 2 of the Philosophical Investigations are specified as, quote, a language consisting of the words block, pillar, slab, beam. A calls them out. B brings the stone which he has learned to bring at such and such a call. Conceive this as a complete primitive language. Well, these calls, ausrufen is the verb, are properly so called. They're signals, appropriately responded to, according to the practice, in one way rather than another. But it's important to realize they are not orders. They're not imperatives in this language. For an order isn't just something it's appropriate to respond to in one way and not in another. An order specifies how it's appropriately responded to by saying what it is one must do in order to comply. Shut the door can be a saying of the imperative kind, but only in part of a larger practice in which the door is shut can be a saying of the declarative kind. Well, I want to suggest, and this is something I've discussed at length elsewhere, that we treat assertional practices or abilities as PV necessary for any autonomous practice that we count as discursive. That is, that we think of asserting as the minimal kind of doing that counts as a saying. Well, okay, but what's asserting? I think the beginning of wisdom in answering this question is to see that asserting and inferring are internally related practices, in the sense that each is PP necessary for the other. Assertions are essentially, and not just accidentally, speech acts that can play the role both of premises and conclusions of inference. In my book, Making It Explicit, I pursue the explanatory strategy of treating the connections in both directions as also PV sufficiency relations. This is a bold and deservedly contentious theoretical result, a theoretical approach. Here, I'm making only the much weaker and less controversial claim that only doings that can serve as both kinds of termini for inferrings should be thought of as assertings, if you put the point pragmatically, so that only what can stand in inferential relations should be thought of as the contents expressed by declarative sentences when the very same point is put semantically. According to this way of thinking, inferential practices are PP necessary components of every autonomous practice, hence PV necessary for the deployment of every autonomous vocabulary, hence PV necessary for the deployment of every vocabulary whatsoever. They are universally PV necessary. The combination of this assertional pragmatic criterion of demarcation of the discursive and the inferential necessary condition on assertion is a distinctive kind of pragmatic rationalism about the discursive. Language games, Sprachspiele, must, according to this line of thought, include practices of giving and asking for reasons, because assertions, the most basic kind of sayings, must be capable both of serving as and standing in need of reasons. Pragmatic rationalism is the view that language does have a downtown, and it comprises the practices of making claims and giving and asking for reasons for them. It may be worth noting in passing that this view permits a substantive response to Derrida's charge that philosophers have self-servingly fetishized reason-giving, which he sees as simply one game one can play with language, deserving no privilege of any kind relative to the myriad of others. Rather than simply ignoring Derrida, or demonizing him as a dangerous irrationalist just for raising the challenge, on the one hand, or spinelessly acquiescing in the radical conclusion he draws from what he takes to be the unanswerability of his challenge to justify privileging what he calls logocentrism on the other, the pragmatic rationalist offers a responsive answer to that challenge. That our expressions play a suitable role in reasoning is an essential necessary part of our saying and their meaning anything at all. Apart from playing such a role in justification, inference, criticism, and argument, sentences and other locutions would not have the meanings appealed to and played with by all the other games we can play with language. We philosophers should be proud to acknowledge and affirm our logocentrism, but we should also justify it by an account of the relations between meaning and use, between conceptual content and discursive practice. Well, if those PV necessity claims are correct, then there are two abilities that must be had by any system that can deploy any vocabulary as part of the autonomous discursive practice of which the use of that vocabulary is a part. The ability to respond differentially to some sentence tokenings as expressing claims that the system is disposed to assert, and the ability to respond differentially to moves relating one set of such sentence tokenings to another as inferences the system is disposed to endorse. Those may be treated as primitive abilities for the purpose of algorithmic elaboration of further abilities, for which they are in that sense PP sufficient. If we do that, we see that the algorithmically primitive abilities to make assertions and sort inferences into those that are and those that are not materially good ones, from the point of view of the system, in the sense of making such a distinction in practice, regardless of whether one or not one gets the distinction right by some further standard, suffices to elaborate practices that are PV sufficient to deploy further vocabulary, in particular, conditional locutions. That constellation of basic meaning-use relations then institutes a pragmatically mediated resultant semantic relation between the original vocabulary and the more complex vocabulary that involves conditionals relating sentences deployed in the underlying autonomous discursive practice. And here you have a picture of that I'm going to be trying to justify a meaning-use diagram labeled elaborating conditionals. In this meaning-use diagram, The fact that the rectangle representing one set of practices or abilities is contained in another indicates that the smaller one is PP necessary for the one it's contained in. Here's a very rough sketch of how the algorithmic elaboration in question might work. By hypothesis, the system has the ability to respond differentially to the inference, say, from P to Q by accepting it or rejecting it. It also must have the ability to produce tokenings of P and Q in the form of assertings. We assume that since it can produce those assertions, we can teach it also to produce assertively tokenings of the new form, if P then Q, that is, just to utter those assertingly. What's required then is first that this new sort of response, saying if P then Q, be hooked up responsively to the previously discriminable stimulus so that it's asserted just in those cases where the inference from P to Q would have been responded to as a good one. This is an exercise of the algorithmic elaborative ability that I earlier called response substitution. All that's required is that it responsively connect a previously distinguishable stimulus kind, its endorsement of an inference, to an already elicitable performance kind, the assertion if P then Q. This rule codifies the circumstances of appropriate application of the newly introduced conditional sentences, relating sentences deployed already in the basic autonomous discursive practice. For the consequences of application, we need another bit of response substitution. The system can already, by hypothesis, respond to some stimuli by treating an inference as good or bad. We must now hook up that response to the new stimulus kind. The system must respond to its assertion of the conditional, if P then Q, by treating the inference from P to Q as a good one. For instance, by being disposed to endorse Q assertionally if it's disposed to assert P conditionally, to endorse P assertionally. These new differential responsive abilities that are achieved just by reshuffling prior ones then settle the state table that specifies how the system is able to respond to different presented stimuli, non-logical sentences and inferences involving them, and now also conditional sentences and inferences involving them, paradigmatically modus ponens. In a clear sense, then, the capacity to distinguish good from bad inferences involving non-logical sentences is PP sufficient for the ability to deploy conditionals involving those sentences. That's what's represented in that meaning-use diagram. But the pragmatically mediated semantic relation between the vocabulary of conditionals and any autonomously deployable vocabulary that obtains in virtue of the PV necessity of material inferential practices or abilities for the deployment of any vocabulary includes another crucial element as well. For conditional sentences, let one say something where before one could only do something. Saying that if something is copper, then it conducts electricity is a new way of doing, by saying, what one was doing before by endorsing the material inference from that is copper to that conducts electricity. That is, conditionals let us make explicit something that otherwise was implicit in the practical sorting of non-logical inferences into good or bad. Where before one could only in practice take or treat inferences as good or bad, after the algorithmic introduction of conditionals, one can endorse or reject the inference by explicitly saying something, by asserting or denying the corresponding conditionals. What the conditional says explicitly is what one endorsed implicitly by doing what one did, namely accepting or rejecting the inference. The expressive role distinctive of conditionals, whose use is elaborated in the way I've just specified, is to codify inferences, to specify inferential practices or abilities, to explicate them, in the sense of making explicit something that was implicit in them. And that is to say that the meaning-use diagram for the resultant meaning-use relation that's put in play by the introduction of conditionals is really the slightly more complicated one that comes next on your handout, elaborated explicating LX conditionals, which has added that fifth primitive meaning-use relation. Conditionals are both elaborated from and explicative of inferential practices. As shorthand, I'm going to call this important kind of pragmatically mediated semantic relation between vocabularies an LX relation. It obtains when some practices or abilities PV necessary for the deployment of one vocabulary can be algorithmically elaborated, that's the L part, into a set that is PV sufficient to deploy a vocabulary that's VP sufficient explicitly to specify or codify the original set of practices. That's the X part. Just in virtue of being able to assert and to sort inferences into materially good and materially bad ones, once again, whether or not correctly, one already knows how to do everything necessary in principle to introduce vocabulary that will let one say something new, something the saying of which is taking some inferences to be good and others not to be good. And conditionals are paradigms of logical vocabulary. For instance, the conditional is the very first bit of logical vocabulary Frege introduces in his Begriffsschrift, the founding document of modern logic. I want to suggest that the meaning-use analysis that I just offered of conditionals specifies the genus of which logical vocabulary is a species. That genus is specified by three characteristics. First, being deployed by a set of practices or abilities that are algorithmically elaborated from. Second, practices or abilities that are PV necessary for every autonomous vocabulary, and hence for every vocabulary whatsoever. And the third, suffice to specify explicitly those PV necessary practices or abilities. Any vocabulary meeting those three conditions I'll call a universal LX vocabulary. In a later lecture, I'll offer more details about how one can think of other logical connectives as exhibiting this pattern of pragmatically mediated semantic relations to non-logical vocabularies generally. But by way of anticipatory illustration, I can say that just as I take it that every autonomous discursive practice must involve distinguishing some inferences as materially good, so it must involve distinguishing some claims as materially incompatible with others. That a monochromatic patch is red rules out its being blue. Only algorithmic elaboration is required to turn the ability to distinguish the material incompatibility of claims into the ability to deploy logical negation. And once that bit of logical vocabulary is deployed, it, together with the conditional, lets one say that two claimables are materially incompatible. Because you can say things like, if a monochromatic patch is red, then it is not blue. That is, negation lets one make explicit in the form of claims, something that can be said, and so thought, a relation that otherwise remains implicit in what one merely practically did, namely treat two claims as materially incompatible. So, negation is also going to qualify as being LX, elaborated explicating, for every autonomous vocabulary, and hence is belonging to the pragmatically specified semantic genus within which I'm now suggesting we locate logical vocabulary. So, I'm suggesting that standing in this complex resultant meaning-use relation to every autonomously deployable vocabulary can serve as at least a partial answer to a central question in the philosophy of logic, the demarcation question. That question is, roughly, what is logic? Or somewhat more carefully, what is logical vocabulary? That is, what features should be taken as distinguishing some bit of vocabulary as distinctively logical vocabulary? Even if we envisage a complete answer as taking the form of necessary and sufficient conditions, the general demarcational question is still normally understood to concern the circumstances of appropriate application of the term logical vocabulary. But a question of that kind comes with reasonably definite criteria of adequacy for assessing the correctness of an answer only in the context of a relatively clear specification of the consequences of application being associated with the expression at issue. That is, when we ask whether, say, modal vocabulary or set theoretic vocabulary is a kind of logical vocabulary, what turns on the answer? What will we have found out if the answer turns out to be yes? What is the difference that makes a difference? The demarcational question can sensibly be addressed only if we address also the at least coordinate and maybe even prior question concerning the theoretical, explanatory, argumentative, or constructive role logic or logical vocabulary is being envisaged as playing in some larger philosophical enterprise. Of course, there are going to be as many possible answers to that question as there are philosophical programs that assign some privileged role to logic. And they're liable to lead to very different answers to the demarcational question. The appeal to logical vocabulary that I want to focus on is that made by the classical project of philosophical analysis. As I characterized that project in my first lecture, it aims to exhibit some target vocabulary as the result of semantically elaborating some base vocabulary. In the core programs I pointed to, some versions of those privileged by empiricism or naturalism. And I pointed out that logical vocabulary typically plays a special role in this enterprise. One is allowed and encouraged to use logical vocabulary in the process of elaborating one vocabulary into another. This is what I called the semantic logicism of the classical project of analysis. Insofar as the 20th century analytic project did assign such a privileged status to logical vocabulary, it's fair to ask why that privilege should be thought to be legitimate. What are the rules of the analytic game? Why is it all right for the empiricist about theoretical entities to appeal to logical vocabulary, but not to modal or intentional vocabulary in elaborating his analyses? Is it all right for the naturalist to employ modal vocabulary in his elaboration of semantic vocabulary? And if so, is that because modal vocabulary is logical vocabulary? Why does logical vocabulary come for free in analysis, not itself having to be elaborated from, say, the empiricist's or the naturalist's base vocabularies? This is the larger framework in which I want to place logical vocabulary in order to get a standard for assessing various possible principles of demarcation. I want to ask the general demarcational question with the standard of assessment for answers being set by the demand that it vindicate the semantic logicist commitment of the classical project of analysis. That is, I want a way of picking out vocabulary as distinctively logical that explains why it's legitimate to use logical vocabulary, but perhaps not other kinds of vocabulary, in showing how the meanings expressed by one vocabulary can be elaborated out of the meanings expressed by another. My idea, where I'm going with this, is that it's precisely whatever is an LX vocabulary with respect to every autonomous vocabulary that can legitimately be appealed to as an auxiliary elaborating vocabulary in semantic analysis. Semantic logicism would then be justified because logical vocabulary is such a universal, pragmatically elaborated, explicitating vocabulary. All right, so that's where I'm going. What conditions must a vocabulary meet in order for it to serve as a suitable auxiliary in the project of semantically analyzing one vocabulary in terms of another, in a suitably broad sense of analyze? They would seem to be of two different kinds, which pull against one another so as to create what might be called the logicist's dilemma, looking over our shoulder at Hempel's famous article, The Theoreticians Dilemma, which makes a comparable point. On the one hand, the auxiliary vocabulary should not add anything distinctive of its own. For any substantive content that it contributes impugns the claim that what can be said in terms of the target vocabulary is somehow present already in the base vocabulary, or at least is intelligible entirely in terms of what that vocabulary expresses. The general thought is that the auxiliary vocabulary can help articulate what's expressed in another way by the base vocabulary, can in some sense draw out what's implicit in it. And the claim that the version of what's expressed in the target vocabulary that emerges from that process really was already implicit in the base vocabulary, needing only further articulation to become visible as such, would be undercut insofar as further new content was imported by the auxiliary elaborating vocabulary. For perhaps the semantic content in question is really implicit only in the auxiliary vocabulary, or only when that's put together with the base vocabulary. There's no interest to the claim, say, that culinary vocabulary supervenes on chemical vocabulary if it turns out we mean that it does so if we can also help ourselves to the vocabulary of home economics as an auxiliary in securing that relation. I'm going to call this the requirement of semantic transparency on the suitability of a vocabulary to serve as an auxiliary in the analytic enterprise, that is, as playing the role there traditionally assigned to logical vocabulary. Something like this line of thought, I think, played a significant role in 20th century philosophical approaches to the demarcation of logical vocabulary that appealed to its formality. For if logic were purely formal, concerned only with the form of thought and not with its content, then logical vocabulary itself might be thought to be devoid of content, and hence semantically transparent in exactly the way required for it to play the role in semantic analysis that logicism assigns it. Tempting as this line of thought is, it's become increasingly difficult to maintain or pursue it, and the best discussion of this is in John MacFarlane's doctoral dissertation, unfortunately not yet published, John. For how is the contrast between semantic form and content supposed to be drawn so as to underwrite criteria of demarcation for logical vocabulary? We're no longer in a position to subscribe to the collateral commitments required to appeal to Aristotelian or scholastic hylomorphism, nor indeed to Kant's transcendental faculty hylomorphism, which are really the home language games of the form-content distinction. And we know now that a purely syntactic characterization of form, say of Hilbert's sort, can't do the semantic job we're addressing, not even for the target vocabulary of arithmetic. And it should be acknowledged that Frege never thought of logic as purely formal or of purely logical concepts as contentless. So he's not part of that tradition. The closest we come, I think, is a broadly Fregean identification of formality with semantic invariance under substitution. And this is also a key idea of Bolzano. And this is the idea that Quine has championed. To say that an inference is good or a claim true in virtue of its logical form is to say two things: that the inference is good or the claim is true, and that it remains good or true upon arbitrary substitution of non-logical for non-logical vocabulary. That is indeed a sufficiently crisp concept to be useful for many purposes. But it's important to realize that this notion of form and formality is of no help at all in the context of the question about semantic logicism that we're addressing, and that for two connected reasons. First, it doesn't provide, but rather presupposes a criterion of demarcation for logical vocabulary. Unless we can already distinguish logical from non-logical vocabulary, we can't begin to apply the test. And that means, as Frege himself insisted, that the fact that an inference is good or a claim true in virtue of its logical form in this sense is not at all incompatible with its substantive contentfulness. For we can pick any vocabulary we like to privilege substitutionally. An inference is good and a claim true in virtue of its theological form or its geological form, just in case the inference is good or the claim is true and remains so under all substitutions of non-theological for non-theological vocabulary or non-geological for non-geological vocabulary. Theological and geological formality will not just depend upon, but will express an important aspect of the content of theological and geological concepts. Because this substitutional notion of formality is promiscuous about the vocabularies it applies to, grinding out a notion of formality for each, it leaves untouched our original question: how to justify the claim that logical vocabulary, however demarcated, can play the role of expressive auxiliary in the philosophical project of wholesale semantic analysis of some vocabularies in terms of others, at least insofar as it satisfies the condition of semantic transparency. The criterion of adequacy that's complementary to semantic transparency, and in tension with it, I want to say, is that a candidate expressive auxiliary vocabulary in such a semantic project must be analytically efficacious. That is, using it must help somehow in the process of establishing the desired semantic relation between vocabularies, however we think of that as definability, translatability, reducibility, and so on. After all, it was to be the powerful modern methods of Frege's Grundgesetze and Russell and Whitehead's Principia that within one core program of analysis were to make the difference between traditional empiricism and its 20th century successor in logical empiricism. For we now had a much more powerful glue available to stick together and articulate what's expressed by the favored base vocabularies, be they phenomenological, secondary quality, or observational. And looking ahead, after the subsequent modal logical revolution in the last third of the 20th century, it's the power of modal vocabulary to serve as a mediating expressive auxiliary vocabulary that some philosophers hope will usher in the new age of semantic naturalism. The Logis's dilemma, or perhaps we should just say challenge, is to explain how logical vocabulary, or indeed any vocabulary, can be at once semantically transparent and analytically efficacious. How it can remain sufficiently modest and unassuming to be eligible while still being in a position to make a substantive contribution to the analytic semantic expressive enterprise. The potential tension between these complementary demands becomes evident, I think, when we reflect that even if we did have available a notion of the mere formality of logic that could satisfy us as to the transparency requirement, it would still be very hard to see how to understand its efficacy, how contentless concepts could help us understand contentful ones. I think the attempt to reconcile some version of these two demands has been the motive force behind a fair amount of wriggling in the philosophy of logic over the last 100 years or so. Here you might think about Wittgenstein's early agonizing about the purity of logic. The claim I want to defend is that being an LX vocabulary with respect to every autonomous vocabulary is necessary and sufficient for playing the privileged role logical vocabulary is called on to play in the classical project of semantic analysis. I've been saying that showing that requires simultaneously satisfying two principal criteria of adequacy. For the first, the fact that practice is sufficient to deploy logical vocabulary can be algorithmically elaborated from practices necessary to deploy any autonomous vocabulary vindicates the semantic transparency of logical vocabulary. For that means that anyone who can talk at all, hence can deploy any base vocabulary, can already do everything one needs to be able to do in order in principle to be able to say what logical vocabulary lets one say. The capacity to deploy logical vocabulary, or indeed any universally LX vocabulary, is in this sense always already implicit in the capacity to deploy any vocabulary at all that might be chosen to serve as the base vocabulary of a semantic analysis or explication of any target vocabulary, whether those appropriate to empiricist, naturalist, functionalist, or any other sort of analysis. And the notion of algorithmic elaboration gives a definite sense to the claim that the one set of abilities is in principle sufficient for the other. This is the sense in which deploying logical vocabulary requires nothing new on the part of discursive practitioners. Anyone who can use any base vocabulary already knows how to do everything needed in principle to deploy any universal LX vocabulary. For the other criterion of adequacy, the fact that logical vocabulary makes explicit features of practices PV necessary to deploy any autonomous vocabulary shows why and how logical vocabulary satisfies the condition of analytic efficacy. Here the main point is that the task for which logical vocabulary must prove itself efficacious is an expressive task, to show how to say, in a different vocabulary, what can already be said using the target vocabulary. Logical vocabulary, then, must make it possible to say something one could not say without it. Actually introducing this explicating vocabulary and applying it, that is, using the expressive resources that turn out to be implicit already in the capacity to deploy other vocabularies, is what one must do in order to do that. When things go well, to say in the base vocabulary, together with the logical, everything one could already say in the target vocabulary. Logical vocabulary gives one the capacity to talk about the inferential articulation of any other vocabulary, about what follows from what, which is an essential part of what makes that other vocabulary express the semantic content that it does. On this account, semantic logicism is a commitment to the effect that being able to make explicit the relations of material inference and incompatibility that are implicit in the use of target and base vocabularies alike is a critical element in establishing any relation between them that could count as a semantic analysis or explication of one in terms of the other, according to whatever more specific model of that one applies, translation, reduction, and so on. It's to this expressive project that the explicitating feature of logical vocabulary, the fact that as universally LX vocabulary, it's VP sufficient to specify some practices PV necessary to deploy any vocabulary, that it makes its distinctive contribution. Here's a way of thinking about this vindication of semantic logicism in terms of the fact that, as I've claimed, logical vocabulary stands to any autonomous vocabulary in the complex, pragmatically mediated semantic relation of being both elaborated from and explicative of practices necessary to deploy that original vocabulary. The logicist's dilemma arises if we think in purely semantic terms, because the first constraint, transparency, seems to require logical vocabulary to be contentless, while the second, efficacy, seems to require it to be contentful. Put that way, the conflict between the two demands is going to be hard to resolve. But if we transpose the issue into a pragmatic key and look at what one must be able to do in order to say various things, to deploy an autonomous vocabulary, to deploy logical vocabulary, we see that the resolution requires only the distinction between potentiality and actuality. Transparency arises from the pragmatic fact that one is already in principle able to do everything one must do to deploy logical vocabulary just by being able to talk at all. That this pragmatic potential was always already in place is the sense in which nothing is added by logical vocabulary. On the other hand, actualizing that potential by introducing and deploying, actually using and applying logical vocabulary, does involve doing something new, something one could in principle have done before, but had not actually done. The dilemma or the paradox is resolved by distinguishing between what one could already do, in a sense made definite by the notion of algorithmic elaboration, and what one actually does. At the pragmatic level, nothing more is needed than the conceptual apparatus Aristotle introduced so long ago, at the dawn of metaphysics, to resolve another apparent dilemma. Now, the semantic relation between LX vocabularies and the vocabularies from which they are elaborated is an essentially pragmatically mediated one. If that relation really is the one that explains and justifies the utility of logical vocabulary in semantic analysis, then all elaboration and explication, including classical semantic elaboration and explication, is implicitly pragmatically mediated. For in order to explain the legitimacy of appealing to logical vocabulary in the semantic elaboration of one vocabulary into another, we must appeal to the pragmatic elaboration of one set of abilities into another. And if that's right, then supplementing the traditional philosophical analytic concern with relations between meanings, expressed by different kinds of vocabulary, by worrying also about relations between those meanings and the use of those vocabularies, in virtue of which they express those meanings, as I recommended this morning, is not so much extending the classical project of analysis as it is unpacking it, to reveal a pragmatic structure that turns out already to have been implicit in the semantic project all along. For the conclusion I've been arguing for is that it's because some vocabularies are universal, pragmatically elaborated, and explicitating vocabularies that semantic analysis in the 20th century logicist sense is a coherent enterprise at all. That strong claim is a central element of a further kind of pragmatism about semantic analysis, what I want to call analytic pragmatism, whose principal tool is meaning-use analysis. Now, my primary concern here has been to use the metaconceptual apparatus of meaning-use analysis first to make clear and then to argue for the ubiquity and theoretical centrality of pragmatically mediated semantic relations by appeal to the idea of universal, elaborated, explicitating vocabularies. Subsequent lectures are going to consider other philosophically important vocabularies, especially modal, normative, and intentional vocabularies, which I will argue can be understood as having the same general kind of meaning-use structure. In particular, in my fourth lecture, tomorrow afternoon, I'll argue that the addition of modal vocabulary to the semantic logicist toolkit, the hallmark of the modal revolution of the last third of the 20th century, can and should be vindicated in just the same way that I've suggested for ordinary logical vocabulary, though of course the features of discursive practice from which its use can be elaborated and which it in turn expresses explicitly are different. In my third lecture tomorrow morning, building on our discussion of practical algorithmic elaboration, I'll begin an investigation of what I will urge should be considered a third core program of the classical project of philosophical analysis, functionalism about intentionality. Here too, I will try to show that what's primarily at issue should be understood in terms of pragmatically mediated semantic relations. In particular, I'll offer a new way of thinking about the commitments involved in the program of artificial intelligence, in terms of the possibility of algorithmically elaborating a set of non-discursive practices or abilities into one that is PV sufficient to deploy some autonomous vocabulary.
We'll pause for a coffee break until 4:30. Coffee's upstairs, and then we'll have the comments of John MacFarlane. So let us resume. We will now have comments from John MacFarlane from UC Berkeley, and then after that, Bob will respond briefly, and then we will open it up for questions. John MacFarlane.
So I find Bob's proposal for demarcating logic very exciting, and in the first part of my comments I'll try to explain why. And then in the second part I'm going to mention a few things that I still find puzzling about his proposal in the hopes that he can clarify them. So in the aforementioned dissertation, which I wrote under Bob's supervision, I argued that in order to understand the confused state of contemporary debates about the demarcation of logic, you have to go back to Kant. Following tradition, Kant thought of logic as a normative discipline with the job of identifying norms for thought. And on this broad construal, it makes sense to talk of, say, a logic of jurisprudence or a logic of geometrical thinking or biological thinking, any particular kind of thought. Kant called these special logics. But in addition to all these special logics, which provide, as he said, rules for correct thinking as regards a certain kind of object, Kant recognized what he called general logic or universal logic, which provides rules for thought as such, just as thought, regardless of its objects. Now, when Kant made his critical turn, the notion of general logic posed a serious problem for him. He took the view that concepts could have representational content or objective validity only insofar as they applied to some object that could be given to us in intuition, that is, in a singular representation. And he now, after the critical turn, held that for us humans at least, all singular representation is sensible. So it follows that concepts can have content only insofar as they apply to potential objects of the senses. And so if we're after norms for thought as such, and accordingly have to abstract entirely from sensibility, since thought as such doesn't include sensibility, we thereby have to abstract entirely from representational content, and hence from truth. So the norms of general logic, if this is right, couldn't be rooted in very general facts about reality, as Kant's Leibnizian predecessors seem to have thought. So for example, in Wolff you can find sentences like, "It's plain that principles should be sought from ontology for the demonstrations of the rules of logic." That's what Kant rejected. Now, the problem was to explain how there could be norms for thought as such if thought is intelligible independently of its relation to objects. These norms couldn't be grounded in metaphysics for the reasons I've just explained, but they also couldn't be grounded in empirical psychology, which seems to tell us how we do think and not how we ought to. So by virtue of what are thinkers, qua thinkers, bound by these norms? Well, Kant's solution is pretty well known because it had a profound impact on thinking about logic well into this century, well into the 20th century and also this century. The norms of general logic, Kant says, concern only the form of thought, as he says, the formal conditions of agreement with the understanding. And that's why they're binding on thought as such, whether or not it relates to potential objects of the senses. But, he says, since these conditions, quoting from Kant, since these conditions can tell us nothing at all as to the objects concerned, any attempt to use logic as an instrument, organon, that professes to extend and enlarge our knowledge can end in nothing but mere talk. So we explain the universal bindingness of general logic on thought by taking it to be formal and denying that it has any content or distinctive concepts of its own. Now, I think this is a nice, satisfying story, even if it rests on a fairly simplistic picture of the formal conditions of thought, that is, the ways in which representations might be unified to form a judgment. Kant had a fairly simplistic picture of that rooted in kind of vaguely Aristotelian logic. In later thinking about logic, this nice, satisfying story begins to unravel. So what happens with Frege, I think, is particularly interesting because given Frege's ambition to show that arithmetic is implicit in pure logic, it really matters for him how logic is picked out. Frege retains the Kantian idea that logic is distinguished from other disciplines by its providing norms for thought as such, but he rejects the Kantian conception of logic as formal. His rejection is, I think, overdetermined. It's due in part to Frege's important technical advances and in part to his philosophical differences from Kant. So Frege's replacement of the old subject-predicate conception of logical structure with a function-argument conception makes Kant's story about the form of thought, as represented in, for example, Kant's table of judgments, unavailable to Frege. right? So for Frege, quantification and negation are no longer regarded as aspects of the ways in which subject and predicate can be related in judgment, but now for Frege, they're concepts in their own right. They're in the same semantic categories as many non-logical concepts. So negation, just a function from objects to objects, right? It's in the same semantic category as any one place predicate. If there's any notion of a form of thought available to Frege, it would be the pattern of functional application. But this is going to be too meager to form the basis of anything recognizable as logic, you know, when you abstract away from the fact that this is a universal quantifier and this is a conditional and so on. You just have a pattern of functional application with functional categories. In addition, Frege rejects some of the Kantian assumptions that required Kant to claim that logic was formal. So he rejects Kant's idea that concepts have content or significance only insofar as they can be applied to objects given an intuition. In part, this is because of his new function argument conception of logical structure, which allows him to see purely quantified judgments as relating to concepts with no relation to an object. He also rejects the Kantian view that all singular representation is sensible, claiming that we can have singular thoughts about nonsensible objects like numbers. So unlike Kant, he's not forced to the view that norms for thought as such must be grounded in the formal conditions for thought. So in the end, Frege clear-headedly rejects the Kantian doctrine that general logic must be formal. He takes logical norms to be grounded in some very general truths about the world, and he takes logic to have its own concepts from whose content it can't abstract. So he says in his article on the Foundations of Geometry, second series, just as the concept point belongs to geometry, so logic too has its own concepts and relations, and it's only in virtue of this that it can have a content. Okay. The trouble is, having jettisoned Kant's explanation of how it could be that logic could be binding on thought as such in this absolutely general way, Frege has no very good explanation of his own to replace it with. So what is it about thought that makes it the case that these very general truths about the world, the ones that are described in Frege's logical axioms, give rise to norms for thought as such? And on this point, I think Frege says nothing very useful and even hints that maybe nothing useful can be said. Now, Frege's student Carnap takes a different approach. He embraces the Kantian idea of formality that Frege rejected, while rejecting the conception of logic as normative for thought as such that Frege and Kant share. So Carnap says, in an early paper, the formal sciences do not have any objects at all. They are systems of auxiliary statements without objects and without content. So as such, they're completely unconstrained by facts about the world. They constrain thought by defining a kind of linguistic framework within which thought can proceed. But because we can pick different frameworks for different purposes, no one framework can lay claim to being general in Kant's sense, that is, to being normative for thought as such. In fact, we may use different, even incompatible systems of rules in different inquiries for different purposes. Okay, so you have Frege on the one hand embracing the generality idea in Kant and rejecting formality. You have Carnap embracing formality, rejecting the generality idea. Other thinkers rejected both of these elements of the Kantian view of logic, finding them insufficiently intelligible for scientific purposes. So since this is Prague, I must mention Bolzano, who combined a criticism of Kantian talk of formality with a kind of skepticism that any principled line can be drawn between logical and non-logical notions. In the 20th century, we find Tarski with a similar kind of skepticism at first about whether you can draw a principled line between logical and non-logical constants. And then later in his life, we find Tarski proposing a demarcation of logical constants as those that are invariant under permutations of the underlying domain. Now here he's appealing to considerations that are independent of either generality in the Kantian or Fregean sense, that is, normativity for thought as such, and also independent of the formality idea. And it seems to me that certainly these considerations about permutation invariance are incapable of justifying a kind of privileged role for logical vocabulary in conceptual analysis, which is what Bob was interested in his lecture. Now, by the late 20th century, I think things had just gotten very confused. So there's a lot of proposals out there about how to demarcate logic, about what's distinctive of logic or the logical constants. All of these proposals made some contact with how the discipline was historically conceived, but it had become, I think, quite unclear what the debate was really about. And many thinkers, reflecting on the situation, quite reasonably concluded that the demarcation problem was just a pseudo-problem, either because logic is something like a family resemblance concept with no principled definition, or because they thought that all analytical consequences should be counted as logic, as Barwise and Etchemendy think, or because the historical trunk of logic had by now branched into too many different things with nothing particular in common. So it's unclear. There's a lot of debates, what is logic, and people are coming down on one side of the debate or the other, but I think by the late 20th century it had become pretty unclear what the debate was really about. Now, what I like about Bob's proposal for demarcating logic is that it connects quite directly with what I regard as the historically central tradition of thinking about logic, the one that runs through Leibniz and Kant and Frege. And in fact, I think it can be regarded as a pragmaticized, modernized version of the Kantian view. So on Bob's view, thought, or as he would prefer to say, discursive activity, has a form, insofar as it's made possible by the existence of certain basic practices or abilities. For example, he says, in order to count as engaging in discursive activity at all, you've got to be able to do something that counts as classifying propositions into those that you'd assert and those that you'd reject, and as classifying inferences into those that are good and those that are bad. Got to have those practical abilities to count as engaging in discursive activity at all. Logical vocabulary, on Bob's view, is vocabulary that's both elaborated from and explicative of these basic practices. That is, of the pragmatic form of discursive activity. It can be legitimately applied in explicating any other vocabulary because the ability to deploy the logical vocabulary, the ability to deploy that other vocabulary that you're explicating already suffices when appropriately algorithmically elaborated to deploy the logical vocabulary as well. So we have here a kind of explanation of the universal applicability and universal bindingness of logic on discourse that appeals to logic's essential connection to the very form of discursive activity. In short, it's a view with basically the same shape as Kant's view. Now, there are also many differences, of course. For example, Bob has no real reason to deny that logic has its own contentful concepts. But I want to emphasize here what's in common between Bob's view and the Kantian view. Now, I think once Bob's proposal is in view, we can see how other demarcation proposals that you find in the 20th century, and specifically I have in mind the Gensen-inspired proposals of Popper, Neal, Hacking, and many others, might be seen in a similar light. For they all take the logical vocabulary to be vocabulary whose use can be explained by algorithmic elaboration from certain basic abilities, like the ability to distinguish good inferences from bad or to recognize certain sorts of patterns. That's not how their proponents put it, but that's a way of thinking about what they're doing. The missing piece in all these projects is an argument that these basic abilities are essential to anything that can count as discursive activity at all. And that's what Bob is adding here. I think there's plenty of room here for interesting argument. So, for example, one question you might have is, well, if quantifiers are to count as logical on Bob's view, it must be because any autonomous discursive practice must include subsentential structure. And one might well wonder, why should that be the case, right? So anyway, that's a template for how you would argue that a quantifier is a piece of logical vocabulary. You would have to argue first that any autonomous discursive practice would have to include subsentential structure. You might wonder, why couldn't you have an autonomous discursive practice that just had, say, finite number, say 200 sentences, stood in inferential relations, and so on. Well, having said why I like Bob's proposal, I now want to raise some questions about it. And I'm not sure any of them really rise to the level of objections. There may be quite straightforward answers to them, so they really are just questions. Here's my first question. After presenting the meaning-use diagrams for his paradigm of logical vocabulary, the conditional, Bob says, I want to suggest that the meaning-use analysis just offered of conditionals specifies the genus of which logical vocabulary is a species, a genus he calls universal LX vocabulary. And that suggests that Bob doesn't take all universal LX vocabularies to be logical vocabularies. Right? There should be other species in the genus besides logical. But I wonder why not? Why don't all universal LX vocabularies count as logical? Does he have in mind an example of a universal LX vocabulary that's not logical? And if so, to what conception of logicality is he appealing in making that judgment, in saying, this one, although it's universally LX, is not logical? I can see the motivation for identifying logical vocabularies with universal LX ones, especially given Bob's claim that, quote, being an LX vocabulary with respect to every autonomous vocabulary is necessary and sufficient for playing the privileged role logical vocabulary is called on to play in the classical project of semantic analysis. Right? We have this special role that logic has been given. Bob thinks that being universally LX is necessary and sufficient for playing that role. So I can see the motivation for saying, yeah, being universally LX is being logical. And moreover, as I've said, I think that the idea of an LX vocabulary, universally LX vocabulary, can be connected directly with a venerable tradition of thinking about logic. If we're now going to add an extra necessary condition beyond that on logicality to pick out the species, I think we're at risk of creating a Frankenstein concept that no one would have reason to care about. But I'm eager to see what Bob says about this. I may have missed something important. Now, my other two questions concern the relations of PP sufficiency and VP sufficiency, the L and the X to which Bob appeals to in defining universal LX. So let's start with PP sufficiency. So now Bob says, little quote, the notion of algorithmic elaboration gives a definite sense to the claim that one set of abilities is in principle sufficient for the other. This is the sense in which deploying logical vocabulary requires nothing new on the part of discursive practitioners. Anyone who can use any base vocabulary already knows how to do everything needed to deploy any universal LX vocabulary. That's the quote. But of course, this is true, this last claim, that anyone who can use any base vocabulary already knows how to do everything needed to deploy any universal LX vocabulary. That's true only for practitioners who already possess whatever abilities are needed for the algorithmic elaboration of one practice or ability from others. For example, the ability to select which practice or ability to exercise based on the state it's in, or the ability to chain together two practices or abilities so that the output of one serves as the input to the other. A creature that didn't possess these basic algorithmic meta abilities would not have everything needed in order to deploy any universal LX vocabulary. So a more careful statement of the claim that Bob makes would be this. Anyone who can use any base vocabulary and who has all capacities for algorithmic elaboration already knows how to do everything needed to deploy any universal LX vocabulary. In fact, there's other places where Bob says it that way. He says algorithmic PP sufficiency is what holds in a case if a system does have these algorithmic abilities, then that's all it needs to elaborate its basic abilities into the complex one in question. Now, this restatement makes it obvious that underlying Bob's demarcation of logical vocabulary is a pragmatic demarcation of capacities into algorithmically elaborative capacities and all the others. And if we were to restrict the class of capacities that count as algorithmically elaborating, say by restricting them to those that could be implemented in a finite state automaton, it seems that we would accordingly reduce the class of universal LX vocabulary. And on the other hand, if we increased what counted as an algorithmically elaborative capacity, we could potentially increase the vocabulary that counts as LX, as universal LX. So I wonder then, how much of the work of demarcating universal LX vocabulary is being carried by the underlying demarcation of algorithmically elaborative capacities? And this is really just a question. How sensitive is Bob's demarcation of logic to this underlying demarcation? Is he presupposing any particular demarcation of algorithmically elaborative capacities, right? As he notes, there are serious differences in strength between different idealizations of algorithmic elaborability. So single state automata, finite state automata, two-stack push-down automata, and so But he doesn't say which of these he's proposing in his analysis in talking about PP sufficiency. And so he doesn't make clear how much of the load of demarcating logical vocabulary is borne by this choice. Okay, so let's now turn to VP sufficiency. And I want to consider the paradigm example that Bob thinks about in this chapter, that of conditionals. The vocabulary of conditionals is supposed to, quote, suffice to explicitly specify the practice or ability of distinguishing good material inferences from bad ones. So I'm talking about, on the handout in the second meaning use diagram for this talk, I'm talking about the arrow labeled 5. Now, on a weak reading, the claim here might be just that by using conditionals, we can partially describe, say true things about, the inferential practice. Right, so the vocabulary up here partially describes the practice down here. But on a stronger reading, the claim would be that by using a language of conditionals, we can, in principle, fully describe the inferential practice. I suspect that Bob intends the stronger reading here. He says in lecture 1 that VP, here I'm quoting, VP sufficiency is the relation that holds between a vocabulary and a set of practices or abilities when that vocabulary is sufficient to specify those practices or abilities. VP sufficient vocabularies let one say what it is one must do to be engaging in those practices or exercising those abilities. And I take it that to specify a practice, I mean, one would naturally assume, it's not just to say some true things about it, but to characterize it completely. A stronger reading is also suggested by lecture 1's syntactic examples. So when Bob notes that context-free vocabularies suffice to specify any Turing machine, the claim is that they suffice to specify the Turing machine completely, not just partially. The latter claim wouldn't be very interesting. And it seems to be required for the idea that pragmatic expressive bootstrapping can occur when one vocabulary is VP sufficient for practices or abilities that are PV sufficient for another vocabulary, right? You wouldn't really have bootstrapping unless the vocabulary fully described the practice. But it seems to me that in the paradigm case of conditionals, Bob is only entitled to the weaker claim that the language of conditionals partially describes the inferential practice that it's elaborated out of, or it could be algorithmically elaborated out of. It's plausible, I think, that by using conditionals, we can partially describe the inferential practice that gives our concepts their contents. But to completely characterize this practice, we're going to need more expressive power. And the reason is that material inferences are, in general, non-monotonic. Whether one takes the inference from A to B to be a good one, and so endorses the conditional A arrow B, will depend not just on A and B, but on one's other commitments. For example, I might endorse the inference from the match is struck to it will light in most circumstances, but not when I also endorse the match is wet. So knowing what conditionals a speaker is prepared to endorse tells us only about what inferences she's prepared to endorse now, given her current set of background commitments. But this is plainly not enough to completely characterize her inferential practices. Two inferential practices that agree on which inferences are good relative to a set K of background commitments might diverge wildly on which inferences are good relative to a different set K prime. To describe the differences between these two inferential practices, it seems to me, you're going to need more than the language of conditionals. It's not going to help to add the background conditions explicitly to the antecedents of the conditionals because, in general, the required ceteris paribus clauses won't be finitely specifiable. As Bob says in his 4th lecture, there need be no definite totality of possible diffusers specifiable in advance. So if conditionals aren't VP sufficient to completely specify an inferential practice, you might wonder, is there some other piece of vocabulary that is? Now, I don't think that bringing in modal vocabulary and counterfactual conditionals is going to help here. So counterfactuals can give you partial information about how the inferences a speaker endorses depend on her background assumptions. But I don't see how they can give us full information about this that we would need for a complete specification of an inferential practice. And the reason, again, is that endorsement of the counterfactuals themselves will depend on background conditions. Right? This corresponds to the role played by the actual world in the Lewis semantics for counterfactuals. So if I think there's a trampoline below me, I might endorse the counterfactual. If I jumped out of this window, I'd live. But if I thought there was a moat containing crocodiles, then I wouldn't endorse it. So which counterfactuals you endorse will tell you something about how the inferences you endorse depend on changes in background conditions, but those counterfactuals themselves depend on, your willingness to endorse them depends on background conditions. So I don't see how, even with the modal and counterfactual vocabulary mixed in there, you're going to get something that completely characterizes the underlying inferential practice. So a vocabulary V, such that a set of sentences in the language L union V, L is the base language, together with V, a vocabulary V such that a set of sentences in L union V can completely specify the material inferential practices underlying the language L, would presumably need to contain an entailment relation and a way of talking about countably infinite sets of sentences. Right? Then we could get in all the background conditions. We could then say things like, the set X of sentences entails the sentence A relative to the set Y of background commitments. And I think the totality of sentences in that language, using this relative to a set of background conditions entailment notion, and names for, or ways of denoting countably infinite sets of sentences, totality of sentences in that language could completely specify the background inferential practices. But now I think we're outside of paradigm logical vocabulary territory. Certainly it's a far cry from the comfortable conditional. And it also seems unlikely that this vocabulary is going to be supported by practices that could be algorithmically elaborated from practices necessary for any autonomous vocabulary. So the worry is that this vocabulary would not count as being universally LX. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John. That's thoughtful and challenging. I think I know what to say about two of John's three questions, so that's what I'm going to say first. And I won't say much about the middle one unless I happen to think of something between now and then. His first question is, yeah, I was pretty careful to describe being universally LX as the genus of which logical vocabulary is the species. What's being left room for there and why? Why not just identify this with logical vocabulary? I think you could do it. Doing it that way is more revisionary than doing it the way I would like to do it. That is, lots of stuff that people don't normally think of as logical vocabulary would come in. What I have in mind is, of the features of discursive practice that seem plausibly to be really essential, some of them are semantic and some of them are pragmatic. So the semantic ones, I think, generally have to do with the inferential articulation of things. And that's the species that I think probably ought to be identified with logical vocabulary. And you'll get an answer that at least includes all the classical logical vocabulary and not too much else. But there are also things like the original argument was that besides the inferential dimension, there was an assertional dimension. That is, nothing that doesn't involve your capacity to commit yourself assertionally is going to count as a discursive practice. And this is something I'll actually talk about in the fourth lecture. And that means that if there's a way of algorithmically elaborating vocabulary that attributes commitments to people, paradigmatically propositional attitude describing locutions, just from the ability to actually take people as having made claims and committed themselves, and parenthetically, though it's no part of my of what I'm going to do in these lectures, I think there is. That is, I think there's a way of algorithmically elaborating implicit ability in practice to distinguish somebody as having made an assertion and committed himself into the capacity to say things like, John claims that, John believes that, such and such, then propositional attitude describing locutions are going to come out as universally LX. So I think they are. And I think it's sensible to distinguish between the things that are universally LX, because they are elaborated from an explicative of, as it were, pragmatic features having to do with what you're doing, the commitments that you're undertaking, and so on, from the semantic that have to do with the inferential relations among things. And it's one very traditional way of thinking about logic is as the science of inference. One picks up that tradition by restricting the notion of logic to the universally LX things that are elaborated from an explicative of inferential relations that are essential to any discursive practice. So that's what I had in mind there. Now, for the third question, you ask, you offered a weak and a strong reading of the VP sufficiency condition as it holds in the meaning-use diagram that's expressing the meaning-use analysis or construction. It's the same thing of the notion of being universally LX, where the question is whether you can make all of the PV necessary practice explicit or only part of it. And here I actually want to say I think it doesn't matter what you say about that, because if you look at the diagram, the PV necessary part, the contained rounded rectangle there, that can contract. We're not claiming that it's the whole PV sufficient practice that's made explicit. It's just got to be some element of it that's necessary, that has to be sufficient to elaborate the vocabulary from, but other than that, it doesn't matter sort of how big it is. So we can say, well, look, it's only an aspect of the inferential practices that is made fully explicit. Even the inferential practices, which are only one aspect, one part of the PV sufficient practices. But even if we acknowledge that it's only one aspect of that that's made fully explicit, so whatever aspect is made fully explicit, so we really do have VP sufficiency in the strong sense, as long as that meets the two conditions, that it's still a necessary aspect of every autonomous practice. So it's the bit of inferential practice that is made explicit by conditionals is one you got to have. And that bit is enough to introduce the conditionals. Then we've got the relation that's involved here. And so I think of that as just shrinking down to whatever the vocabulary is actually sufficient for, subject to the condition that enough is left that you can elaborate that practice from it. And in this case, I think one can do that and say we have that aspect. Now, the other question was about the status of the algorithmic elaborative abilities. Granting that none of us actually have those abilities, since there are going to be some, in this sense, psychological restrictions on us, even if it's just sort of the number of states we can be in. There's presumably some upper bound to that. How exactly do we draw the boundary around this, and how do we motivate drawing the boundary one place rather than another? In one sense, this is not a critical issue, because I can say, look, I'm introducing a notion of one set of practical abilities being in principle sufficient for another. So that I say, you know enough in principle, everything you need to know in principle to do the other. Well, I can just give a clear notion of what in principle means. And I suggested that the algorithmic elaborative abilities that really are constitutive of a Turing machine, of which I was pointing out that though people don't talk about these as among the primitive algorithmic elaborative abilities, things like response substitution and universal state formation are actually always assumed by automaton theorists. Now, what's the motivation for having that particular set of algorithmic elaborative abilities as the sense of in principle that matters here? Well, I have my eye over my shoulder at the AI functionalism core program, as I want to say, of analytic philosophy as a way of thinking about what discursive practices are. So for that one, it's the Turing machines that matter. That's a sort of low strategic reason having to do with what I'm going to go on to discuss to make that the right general conception to have in play. In fact, what I need in order to introduce the conditionals is something only very much weaker than that. The most substantive thing I appealed to was really just response substitution. I mean, if you actually looked at how you would write the algorithm to do it, you would use some other abilities, but nothing nearly as sophisticated as a Turing machine is required to do that. Well, I'm happy enough to have the different notions of algorithmic elaborability sort of indexed by what abilities you actually have in that, give us different notions of PP sufficiency and so different notions of LXness. But because what I ultimately care about is the possibility of giving an algorithmic decomposition of discursive abilities into individually non-discursive abilities, which is what I'm going to say the claim about AI is. If you're going to worry about that, you might as well have the full set of algorithmic elaborative abilities. That's the set that's required for a Turing machine. That can compute everything that can be computed. We don't know a stronger set than that. And we can build machines that can do that. So there's nothing mysterious about that sense of algorithmic elaboration. It clearly would not be sort of sneaking a ghost in the machine in somewhere at the back if you assume those, that full panoply of algorithmic abilities. I'm eventually going to argue against that pragmatic version of artificial intelligence, and the argument against that ought to be addressing the most plausibly workable version of that, which is going to have the strongest, which is going to allow the strongest set of algorithmic elaborative abilities. That all having been said, I don't really know how to think about the rationale for drawing the boundaries in one place or another, and I think that's a really interesting question.
Okay, we'll open up the floor for questions. Please remember that you should use the mic. Michael Kramer.
I want to ask possibly the most basic question one could ask at this point. What is a vocabulary? Let me try to explain why I think that's a question worth asking, why I'd like to have your answer to it. Actually, this goes back to the first lecture, but the question's still bothering me. You had these two diagrams on page 4 that had to do with sellers, one of them about looks and is, where you have a V sub looks phi and V sub is phi, and the other below it, V sub observational, V sub inferential. Now, most of the time when you talk about vocabulary, we use words like the use of a vocabulary, locutions, think conditionals, and so on, which suggests that we're talking about linguistic items classified in the usual sorts of ways, either syntactically or semantically or something like that. The problem that I have is that as I learned, I think, to think about sellers from you, there aren't observational words and inferential words. Any word that can be used in an observation report can also be used in the conclusion of an inference, and even theoretical vocabulary, that is vocabulary that's now used in a theoretical context, can become observational vocabulary. So the normal way of thinking about vocabulary doesn't help me to understand this diagram and suggests to me that what you mean by vocabulary is something more complicated than what I'm taking it to mean just by, sort of riding on my usual use of the word.
Okay, good. This, of course, is a question I would much rather not answer. I'd rather just sort of keep using the term and have some examples for it. But let me give you the clearest answer that I can to the question and then say something motivationally about it. The best I can do for an answer is that a vocabulary is a set of possible tokenings of linguistic items. So we are indeed, when we talk about observational vocabulary, what that means is observational, that is non-inferentially elicited uses of linguistic expressions. So, as you rightly say, many tokenings of the type read are not going to be non-inferentially elicited, not going to be used in the reporting way, are not going to be have as their causal antecedents the exercise of a reliable differential responsive disposition to discriminate read things. But the observational vocabulary comprises the ones that do. Not just the actual ones, but the possible ones. But if you like, you can think of those as the possible ones just as sort of tuples that have a type and where they would be. So a speaker and who utters them, or throw in any other indices you like for them. So vocabularies, a lot of them are going to be hopelessly gerrymandered and totally uninteresting for that reason. But that's the kind of thing I mean by a vocabulary. Any one of those. As I say, only some of them are interesting. This is a very general category. Why talk about this at all? The word vocabulary, I said, is taken over from Rorty, who was looking for something, for some way of talking about discourse after Quine told us that we couldn't distinguish between theories and languages. And we needed some way to talk about things like theories and languages without thinking that we could draw a sharp distinction between those. Once we saw that what our words mean, what in the Carnapian way of thinking about it would have been determined by the language, is not independent of what we take to be true. What in the Carnapian language would be a theory. Well, all right, we've got these messy Quinean things that include what we take to be true, what inferences we take to be good, and all of that is what's going to be required to have something that's meaningful. And he suggested we talk about those as vocabularies. And I've suggested that a good way of thinking about Rorty's work is to think of him as working back and forth between a naturalistic vocabulary and the vocabulary for talking about our interactions with the world. So the things I wanted to address included things that are vocabularies in a more traditional sense. Normative vocabulary, it might be. Alethic modal vocabulary, it might be. You can identify just as lexical types. So necessary is a bit of alethic modal vocabulary, if not qualified, and so on. So some of them can be picked out that way, but those, of course, identifying by lexical types, that gives you a set of tokenings. So those will be vocabularies in the stricter sense, but also things like demonstrative uses or anaphoric uses. I want to talk about those vocabularies because I want to say things like, though I won't be saying that in these lectures. Any practice that includes demonstrative vocabulary, that is, demonstrative uses of expressions, has to include anaphoric uses as well. You have to be able to pick up the demonstrative anaphorically for it not to be inferentially idle. Well, we know we can't do that by types, so we're going to have to just look at the sets of tokens that are demonstrative uses or anaphoric uses of expressions that also have other uses. So I go for the most capacious possible way of thinking about it. It's just a set of possible tokenings, and then am implicitly shouldering the responsibility every time I talk about one of these things to have some way of saying, well, and which set is that you're after when you talk about intentional vocabulary or indexical vocabulary.
Okay, thanks.
Hugh Price?
Bob, I want to ask what I think is a clarificatory question as well, and I think it's connected to John's third point, the point about VP sufficiency. I mean, when I first encountered the notion of VP sufficiency, I was thinking of a paradigm case as something like, to use an example which has already come up, what's involved in specifying what you need to be able to do in order to use observational vocabulary, in order to be able to make observational reports. And in order to say what we need to be able to do, we need to be able to use terms like stimulus, response, differentiation, disposition, things of that kind. So that vocabulary, the vocabulary in terms of which we specify those practices, belongs to what we might think of as psychology or anthropology. In any case, some kind of theoretical stance on our own practices. But when we come to the case of the notion of VP sufficiency that's involved in your LX diagram for conditionals, that doesn't seem to be the picture that's involved any longer, because presumably you could have creatures who were sophisticated enough to be using conditionals and using a full-blown language in that sense, but hadn't got it into the business of talking about their own practices in the psychological or anthropological sense at all. So the notion of VP sufficiency that seems to be involved in line 5 in your diagram on page 11 here is something like a notion of making explicit, being able to, as it were, make an explicit move in the language game corresponding to the move which, as someone who indulged in these practices, one only previously made in an unexplicit way. So being able to say, if P then Q, where previously one only, as it were, endorsed the inference or made the inference from P to Q. So, because it has none of the kind of theoretical character of the first kind of example, it seems to me that there's, the notion you really need for the work you want this to do is the kind of second making explicit non-theoretical notion in that sense. Now, I'm sort of perfectly happy with that as long as it's clear that that's the notion in play. But I do think it's important because it marks a kind of a difference which I think is worth marking between your project and some other versions of use theoretic approaches to meaning. For example, Paul Horridge's, where what's going on in those accounts is explicitly something that's done from a theoretical perspective, where we're talking about use in a way which is only available if we've got that sort of anthropological or psychological vocabulary.
Okay, this really is a question about the notion of specification of practices or abilities, because that's the sort of almost ordinary word that goes with VP sufficiency. And the general idea is that that's supposed to be, in the most slogan-y version of this, that's saying what you have to do to be doing something or other. And you're pointing out that there's at least two significantly different species of specification as I've used it. One of which amounts just to description of what the abilities are or what the practices are, which might use the theoretical vocabulary of some established science, or it might be in more ordinary everyday language. But we don't think of the use of logical vocabulary as describing what people are doing. Indeed, the essence of the expressive view of logic, which inter alia I'm putting into the meta-theoretic vocabulary of these lectures, is that logical vocabulary has a distinctive expressive role, distinguished from description. It's making explicit something that is implicit. And that is different from describing, even though we could talk about it as saying what it is you have to do in order to do something. I want a notion of specification that's generic across those two notions of saying what somebody's doing. Now you're raising a useful flag there, because those are very different uses, and so there's a danger of equivocation where one applies the notion of specification based on one of the species, circumstances of application of one of the species holding, and then draws a conclusion that's appropriate to the other. And that's why this is a very useful flag to have raised. I think it's a genus worth holding on to, because I think there are things that there are cases where it's enlightening to see the same diagram here using a specification VP sufficiency, where one of them is using the explicative and the other is using the descriptive vocabulary. One of the issues where it's useful to be reminded of the restrictions on the descriptive vocabulary are when we think about what the rules are for, well, saying what you have to do to be talking. I said early on, the interest of any particular claim that you made about that is very sensitive to what vocabulary you're allowed to use in, say, describing it. If you can use semantic and intentional vocabulary, well, of course, it's easy to say what using the word red properly is. It's using this noise red to mean red. And John McDowell thinks that's as good as you're going to do and as good as you have to do in these cases. For many other purposes, people are interested more in line with traditional projects in analytic philosophy in saying, no, what I want is a VP sufficient account of practices sufficient for applying the meaning read by the word read that are specified in, well, any vocabulary except semantic and intentional vocabulary. So for instance, some would insist that it be in the language of natural science. In making it explicit, I try and do it without intentional or semantic vocabulary, but helping myself to normative vocabulary, and argue that, if you can do that, then you really learn something interesting from it. So that's one way of thinking about the restriction on vocabularies. Issues like that come up for the explicative vocabularies as well. When we look at just the negation by itself, a bit of logical vocabulary that's making explicit things, well, it can't actually make material incompatibilities explicit all by itself. It needs to have the conditional along with it. Whereas the conditional can make some features of inference explicit all by itself, even without negation. So the question, what features of inferential practice can we make explicit with exactly which restrictions on logical vocabulary that we have, that's a substantive one. That's a substantive question in philosophical semantics for various kinds of logic, and I think it bears an important analogy to the kind of question that we get on the descriptive side of, well, what if we allow normative but not intentional vocabulary? What if we don't allow normative but only naturalistic vocabulary? So you're quite right to point to that important and potentially dangerous assimilation that I'm trying to make. But I think it's also a potentially fruitful one.
Okay.
Sebastian Oertel.
John MacFarlane's placing of your account of logic in the history of reflection on logic that runs through Kant and Frege afforded me much illumination, but it also raised a question. The laws of logic in this tradition are conceived as laws of thought, as John explained. So logic, when it articulates these laws, gives at least a partial account of the nature of thought. It explains at least partially what thought is. It is what is under those laws. The idea of the nature of thought that is deployed, I think, in this history is not to be taken lightly. I think it's substantial. The nature of thought is, or in general, the nature of a thing in this context is understood to be it's the principle of the laws to which it is subject. So the nature of thought is that which is the principle, the nature of thought is the principle of those laws, and not only just of those laws, but of their unity, why they form a system. The systematicity of the laws of thought is understood through conceiving them as articulating the nature of thought, and this is how we can be able to speak of thought as such. Now, you have a formally analogous account of logic in saying that any autonomous vocabulary contains the logical concept, as well provides them from itself, just by being a vocabulary. And you get this by saying something about what assertion is. You ask, what is assertion? Say, it must be inference, and then we go from there. But I wonder, what kind of account can you give to the question of this form? What is assertion? You claim to speak about the nature of assertion and say something about it. But I wonder how your general method allows you to say such things, or how you must think of them. Because it's, I mean, in Frege and Kant, it's not just that we speak of the nature of thought in such a way that if something does not have this nature, we just don't call it thought, or we just don't count it as thought. And it's not that we wouldn't count it as such. There's more substance to the idea of a nature of thought, and I wonder, whether you would think of the nature of assertion as something that can be investigated, I think, in the way in which Kant thought he could investigate the intellect.
Okay, well, that's covering a lot of ground. Let me address at least some of it. On the account of logic that I'm giving, it's not correct to say that thought is what is subject to the laws of logic. And that's a traditional thing to say, and that's not part of the tradition that ends up getting reconstructed here. Indeed, the notion of the laws of logic gets pushed almost completely off stage by this way of thinking about logic. On this expressive view, the point of logic is not to prove something. It is not to find laws of thought. The point of logic is to enable us to say something that we couldn't say before. It's an expressive task. They say the slogan is, logic is the organ of semantic self-consciousness. Logical vocabulary lets us say what it is we're doing in virtue of which we are thinking, the inferential structure of it. The laws of logic, as I understand it, of a logic, specify semantically, even if only implicitly, the meanings of the logical connectives. They give us the inferential roles of the logical vocabulary, that is, of the medium that we're using to achieve this kind of substantive self-consciousness. So those laws, though they're elaborated from fundamental features of thought, in particular its inferential articulation, are not governing it in the sort of being thought is thinking according to them, because thought's at a lower than logical level in this account.
Yeah, I understand that, but I could have put the question in terms of logical concepts. I mean, Kant says the intellect supplies the logical concepts from itself, and I understood John MacFarlane as making this kind of connection. In the same way in which Kant and Frege think that thought as such is the source of the logical concepts, in the same way you try to argue that discursive practice as such is the source of the logical concepts. And now the question arises, how do you understand, or what means does your philosophical approach to the illumination of thought and language at all enable you to speak of thought, of that which is an act of this power, so we can make sense of this idea? You reject this. How can you be able to say something about assertion as such in the absence of these heavy metaphysical ideas that both Kant and Frege, I think, share?
Okay. I mean, the closest thing, as John suggested, that I've got to a notion of thought itself or thought in general is discursiveness, discursive practice, that is, deploying some vocabulary. Michael asked what a vocabulary is, and I used the notion of a discursive locution in that. Here I want methodologically to make a distinction. The apparatus, the meta-conceptual apparatus of meaning-use analysis that is my primary topic in these lectures, doesn't require us to say anything about how we draw the boundary around the discursive. At least it does not itself take a stand on that issue. It's not illuminating us about what kind of unity the discursive has, what kind of identity it has. It's a kind of conceptual machinery into which you can plug your idea of what's required for an autonomous discursive practice, how you distinguish between discursive practices and non-discursive practices. It's neutral, I think. Now, because I want to apply that apparatus and show how it can illuminate antecedent philosophical problems that we've got, I'm plugging into it subsidiary commitments that I have antecedently about the necessary inferential articulation of discourse and how you tell inferential moves and inferential connections from other things. So that discursive rationalism that I was talking about, that's one thing you can plug into this machinery that draws boundaries around the discursive. And you're certainly right that there's going to be a whole lot of collateral commitments involved in drawing the boundary there, in, as I put it, drawing a bright line where I claim there's a good thing to mean by discursive, and so distinguishing the downtown of linguistic practice. But there's lots of other ways of doing it, and this apparatus is not supposed to constrain you for that. So there ought to be, if we wheel in the heavy metaphysical machinery of Kant, say, a lot of this apparatus you still ought to be able to use to express Kantian views. Some of the diagrams will look the same and some of them will look different if you know, it's Kant's views about these things one has.
Rafaela? I'm sorry, I don't know your last name. Yeah, no, it's you. Yeah. I just wanted to, you should say your last name. Say it into the mic.
Giovagnoli.
Okay, good.
My question concerns the concept of experience, because in several places you introduce the notion of experience as the exercise of reliable disposition to respond to environmental stimuli by applying concepts. And in this case, it seems to me that experience is directly related to practices that are PV necessary. I wonder whether you have now a wider concept of experience. You introduce a new concept of experience by referring to practices that are PV sufficient.
Okay. Generally, I want to say experience is not one of my words.
Yes, I know. I know.
You know, I think John has done yeoman work in rehabilitating it, but I still choose not to talk that way. But you know, perceptual judgment is real. The phenomenon that people perhaps injudiciously use this venerable philosophical term to talk about. You know, there is something like that, and again, when I'm pouring wine into the bottles that are this abstract meta-conceptual apparatus and thinking about actual vocabularies and what we ought to say about them, I do think of observational vocabulary as something that it's at least VP necessary if we're specifying the practice or ability of making non-inferential reports or forming perceptual judgments, to have on the one hand reliable differential responsive dispositions. That's why blind people can't report red things, or even red-green colorblind people can't non-inferentially report the presence of red things because they don't have those reliable differential responsive dispositions which are in principle, non-discursive abilities in the sense that I'll talk about tomorrow morning. That is, things that cannot engage in any autonomous discursive practice, like pigeons, can still have reliable differential responsive dispositions to respond differentially to red things. So that's one set of, one aspect of the practices that are necessary, I would say, for any autonomous discursive practice. Which we can specify in the sort of anthropological or psychological vocabulary that Hugh Price was talking about. Now, another aspect of those non-inferential reporting practices that is, well, PV necessary for any autonomous discursive practice, and which we can in another vocabulary specify, so a VP sufficient vocabulary for this aspect of them, is that those differential responses that are elicited by non-inferentially by the red thing have to be the application of concepts, not just the making of noises, but the making of a move in a game of giving and asking for reasons. And I claim that any vocabulary that is sufficient for specifying that aspect of those practices is going to have to be normative. It's going to have to involve concepts like commitment, committing yourself, like endorsing a claim, like undertaking a certain kind of responsibility. So when I think about those actual practices and the vocabularies that are needed to specify them, it seems to me that there's two kinds of vocabulary, at least, going to be needed in specifying those non-inferential reporting capacities, which are PV necessary for any autonomous discursive practice. One of which, at least, has to involve normative, the use of normative vocabulary, the other of which may not. Is that
Thanks.
helpful? Okay.
Bernd Breen?
Yeah, in the course of your lectures, you identify logical, modal, and normative vocabularies as universally LX. And that means all of those vocabularies serve to specify our practices. And as you acknowledge, well, only the normative vocabulary can serve to specify our practices in a straightforward sense, in the sense of describing those practices, in the sense of saying it is permissible to draw such and such inferences and so on. And about modal vocabulary, you say that that is a kind of transposed language of norms. So when I say that P necessitates Q, I somehow convey that it'll be permissible to infer Q from P.
Of course, I haven't said any of those things yet, but you're right, I'm going to.
Yeah, true. But anyway, what I want to ask is, in what sense is the conditional, well, in what sense exactly does the conditional specify our practices? Is the conditional another transposed language of norms, so that when I use the conditional, I also somehow convey that it would be permissible? Well, anyway, that's a question I haven't found an answer to, even though I have read all of the lectures. And, well, so my question is just a request for a little bit elaboration on that point. And maybe another thought that occurred to me in this respect was that maybe the connection is that both when you use normative and when you use modal vocabulary, you often find yourself using conditional constructions, if then. So when you formulate norms, you often say if condition C obtains, then you should do A, and well, similarly for modal context.
Okay, yeah. I guess the short answer is yes, conditionals are also part of a transposed language of norms in the sense in which the modality is going to be. The conditionals get you, are expressively very thin without the addition of the modal vocabulary, but they're a necessary part of expressing, they're a necessary part of what stands in that relation to normative vocabulary. In Sellers' account, as applied to conditionals, when I say if it's copper, then it'll conduct electricity, so I assert a conditional, I will have conveyed something about my attitude toward the admissibility of a move, that I think it's permissible to move from a copper claim to electrical conductivity claim, even though what I've said is about copper and not about moves. So the same sort of thing that we want to say about modality, we will say about conditionals. And actually, the construction that I use to interpret the modality as a transposed language of norms gives you the modal vocabulary and all the logical vocabulary at once. So all of that is going to go in a box saying that that's a transposed language of norms. even though the rest of us aren't going to understand what we're talking about until tomorrow. Thank you.
Mark Lance?
I want to follow up on what John said in light of what Michael said. In the definition of VP sufficiency, you say that you've got this universal LX vocabulary is deployed by a set of practices that are algorithmically elaborated from practices that are necessary for every autonomous vocabulary, and suffice to specify those, so the same ones, right? Now, there's two directions of tension here. You wanted to answer John's question, you wanted it to be nice and small. But when you talked about how the algorithmic elaboration worked, all you talked about was, well, I'll say A arrow B whenever I want to move from A to B. I wonder why we don't also need moves between the arrow claims, but even leaving that aside, obviously 3 or 4 of those aren't enough. I'm not using a conditional if I just pair up this arrow claim with that propriety and nothing else. Then it's completely indeterminate what arrow means. So what reason do we have to believe that there's a big enough set of inferences? Well, you want, for example, an arrow that expresses non-monotonic entailment to be logic, right? So A non-monotonically entails B. That's a bit of logical vocabulary. So what reason is there to think that there's a big enough set of practical proprieties that can be algorithmically elaborated into a practice in which I'm genuinely using such a conditional, which then the conditionals will completely specify?
Okay, well, you're absolutely right that I'm committed to those things coinciding, to there being an equilibrium between those. And so that's something that stands in need of justification. As far as anything I said today is concerned, the conditional doesn't have to capture the non-monotonicity of material inference. That will be a criterion of adequacy of what you can express with the full-blown modal vocabulary, that you have to be able to express the way in which ranges of counterfactual robustness underwrite non-monotonic material inferences, but we aren't there yet. As you asked, well, what about the relations between the arrow formulae? My picture is that we're going to apply this introduction rule recursively. So that the fact that we've got detachment is already going to give us inferences that we endorse that will underwrite the assertion of conditionals that have conditionals as their antecedents. So we're going to get further embedded conditionals. But mostly, I talked about conditionals or the conditional and didn't commit myself as to which conditional we were talking about. And of course, there's a bunch of them. If you answer the demarcational question, let me start slightly farther back. So traditional philosophy of logic, by traditional I mean like in the 1960s when I was a kid, had 2 questions. One was the demarcational question, what is logic or what distinguishes logical vocabulary? And the other was the normative question, and what's the right logic? What's the right negation? What's the right conditional? Is it classical logic? Is it intuitionism? And so on. And if you look at Quine's short book on the philosophy of logic or Putnam's short book on the philosophy of logic, those are the questions that define the discipline. Now, I've given an answer to the demarcational question in terms of the distinctive expressive role of logical vocabulary, made precise by the notion of LXness and the notion of the sort of meaning-use analysis of something. I say made precise. One of these meaning-use analysis diagrams shows you exactly what subclaims corresponding to the basic arrows you have to make out in order to have made out the claim that the complex resultant applies. So every one of those subclaims you have to make out. But there's a very precise and, as Mark points out, very committive view about what the expressive role distinctive of logical vocabulary is, which is, I claim, a full and complete answer to the demarcation question. And I've invoked the Bolzano-Frege-Quine substitutional notion of how you get a notion of logical form and of inference is good in virtue of their logical form once you've answered the demarcational question. I haven't said anything at all about the normative question. Yeah, but what's the right logic? What's the right conditional? And that's because on this expressive view of logic, that's an ill-formed question. The question is not, what's the correct logic? The question is, for each bit of logical vocabulary, what features of inferential practice is it elaboratable from, and does it make explicit? So people have complained about the two-valued conditional, the horseshoe, that it's a terrible notion of if-then, because it's true as long as it doesn't have a true antecedent and a false conclusion. So people say, well, then that's not the right logic. That's not if-then. That's not making explicit our inferential practices. Well, that's been a thought. But from the expressivist point of view, you want to say rather, well, what aspect, if any, of our inferential practice does it make explicit? Well, that's going to be some dimension of normative appraisal of inferences as good or bad. Now, it's a bad thing about an inference if it has a true premise and false conclusions. So one dimension along which we want to assess the goodness of inference is whether it's good along that dimension. Okay, that's not asking very much, but it would be a bad thing if it didn't have that property. Well, that's the one that's made explicit by the horseshoe. Well, then, it's an okay bit of logical vocabulary, even though it's expressively very weak. The sort of evaluation of inferences that it expresses is not much. The intuitionist conditional, the arrow, makes explicit the sense in which an inference is a good inference if there's a recipe for turning an argument for its antecedent into an argument for its conclusion. Well, that's an important dimension for assessing inferences along, and that's the one that's made explicit by that arrow. The strict implication arrow that I'll talk about in my fifth lecture makes explicit the dimension of evaluation of inferences in which it's a good thing about an inference, a good-making feature of an inference, if it's impossible that the antecedent be true and the conclusion not be true. And so on for relevance arrows and so on. So to really give an answer to the question that Mark asked, well, what makes you think that you're going to be able to get a coincidence of one set of boundaries around practices or abilities or aspects of them that at once is enough to algorithmically elaborate introduction and elimination rules in effect for these conditionals, and which those very same conditionals are then going to let you make explicit? Well, that's a question that we've got to look at for each one of these conditionals to see whether we can do that or not. And my hand-wavy saying, well, for the elaboration, say, if you endorse the inference, then, assert the conditional. Well, what I'm saying now is endorse the inference covers a lot of ground. Do you endorse it in the sense that is made, that it's a good inference in the sense that is answered to by the horseshoe, the two-valued thing, or the intuitionist arrow, or the other one? So, what I'm giving you is a program for a philosophy of logic rather than the worked-out philosophy of logic. So for each of these conditionals, the challenge is going to be to do that, or if you can't, well, then we learn something about it. But my claim is that you can do that for all of the ordinarily well-behaved arrows. It turns out that there's an aspect of the practice that you can get these things to coincide with. But that's a huge promissory note, and if it turns out that that can't be redeemed, that's going to undercut this expressive approach to logic. But at least it's clear exactly what you have to do.
Okay, there's a question here. Maybe you could begin by stating your name so that those of us who don't know it will learn it.
So my name is Hong. It's actually a clarificatory question. As I understand it, I think you try to match up, as it were, some features of the LX vocabularies, or vocabulary satisfying the LX conditions, with two of the criterion sort of adopted by what you call the semantic logicism, in order to make plausible that the LX characterization actually gives the correct answer to the demarcation problem, if I understand correctly. So it seems I have a little problem about the second matching, the matching of the second criterion, namely, I think it's criterion of adequacy. So the idea is, I mean, as I understand it, I mean, the criterion of adequacy, as you defined it, is
of efficacy is what I say. It has to help you in the analytic project somehow.
Sorry, I misspoke. Yeah, sorry. Efficacy, right? And so it seems that criterion has to do with, the ability to. It's a semantic criterion in any case, right? So, but what the feature that you draw upon in order to do the matching is what you call the making explicit of what one can do by allowing one to say that which one does. So there, on the face of it, it doesn't really match. On the one hand, it's what one is able to say is about the vocabulary. It's sort of as about the practice, the practice itself, not the second practice, underlying the second vocabulary. So this is first of all one thing. Secondly, it seems to be because it's making the executory sort of character. It's not. How do you get the semantic efficacy, right? So yeah. That's on the face of it. There's some seems a too quick a step. I'm not sure I might miss something, but just a clarification.
Okay, good. I mean, you're pointing out that the analytic efficacy requirement is that the logical vocabulary has to help you in this semantic, establishing a semantic relation between vocabularies. So what can be said in the one vocabulary can be said in the other. And that seems to be entirely at the level of meanings. And yet we've picked something that is supposed to satisfy that, or we're supposed to understand how it can satisfy it so we're not stuck in the logicist's dilemma by saying, well, look, something about what you do is made explicit by, you're able to say something that you can do. That's, as it were, a semantic pragmatic VP relation that we've got. That there seems like a mismatch in your word between that explicitating notion, which is not a purely semantic notion, and the purely semantic job that the auxiliary vocabulary is supposed to have in the analytic project. And I think you're right that both in your characterization of that and in the conclusion that it seems like too quick a step. There is a lot packed in there. I suppose the quick thing to say is, look, my overall claim is that many interesting semantic relations are pragmatically mediated. So that the right way to think about how to establish a semantic relation is often to take what might seem like a detour through the practices that, for instance, can be specified in one vocabulary and are sufficient to deploy the other vocabulary in the paradigm of a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. In fact, the relation in this case is like the relation that Sellers is talking about when he says that modality is a transposed language of norms. There is a story about what the relationship is between the practices that you're making explicit using the logical vocabulary and the content that of the vocabulary that those practices deploy. We're not going to see that for another couple lectures, so I can't sort of fill in the steps of that quick move that I'm shuffling over here. But all the things we need to fill it in will be filled in when we talk about that transposition move. An intuitive sense of it is, you can get an intuitive sense of it from saying, look, it's okay for the analytic efficacy if we can say how it's helping is making explicit something that was already implicit in the old meanings. If we're doing that, that's an expressive job. That's okay on the transparency side. We're not adding anything because we're saying it was already there implicitly. We're just bringing it out. But bringing it out, making it explicit, is doing something. And making it explicit is putting it in the semantic form. Now, what's implicit is implicit in the meaning of the target or the base vocabulary, only in a sense that you can appreciate by looking at the practices needed to deploy it. So that notion of implicitness is going to take us out of the purely semantic realm into the pragmatic realm. And that's to say that, as I drew the conclusion, if this analysis of what makes something logical vocabulary and at the same time what makes logical vocabulary illicit auxiliary to use in the analytic project is right, then I'm not so much, in telling the story, extending the analytic project as just unpacking something that was implicit in it all along, because understanding the legitimacy of the logical vocabulary requires you to think about pragmatically mediated semantic relations. So in a certain sense, what's skipped over in that quick step is sort of the point of the whole enterprise.
Yarda Peregrine?
Well, I was a little bit puzzled by your answer to Mark's question, because I take it that when you talk about the explicitating role of logical vocabulary, you are basically talking about the logical vocabulary of natural language. And now, when it comes to things like the horseshoe or signs of artificial languages, then it seems to me that we can assign two kinds of tasks to such expression. One kind is they are to explicate the logical vocabulary of natural language. We put forward a kind of conditional as an explication of something like if-then. And then we can, of course, measure it by the successfulness of the explication. It's another thing to say, well, these words play the same role as the logical vocabulary of natural language. That is, they are expressions which are besides the natural language expressions, and they are competing with them, and we simply have to look which kinds of features of the inferential practice we are able to explicitate or not. And I'm slightly puzzled that you are not distinguishing between these two tasks. And I must say, I don't really believe that logic is so much able to fulfill the latter task.
Whereas I don't think it's its job to do the first task. I mean, I do think of logical vocabulary as artificial vocabulary that we introduce. And one of the things that's good about it is that as artificial vocabulary, we have control over it. Those, and by that I mean we've settled what we've committed ourselves to by asserting a sentence that's logically articulated. Those laws of logic that determine the inferential roles and express and articulate the inferential roles of the logical vocabulary just settle its inferential role. So if we disagree about whether this logical sentence commits you to something else, we can settle that, and we're going to find out who's right and who's wrong about it in a way that has no analog for non-logical vocabulary. And I think it's our job as philosophers, and particularly as philosophical logicians, to add to the rich toolbox of such expressive vocabulary, but only subject to the demand that we keep full inferential control over these tools. That's what's going to let them do their expressive job for us. Now, of course, we do have in natural language what you called the logical operators of natural language. We do say if then, we do say not, and so on. That's crucial, and that's our sort of ordinary organ of semantic self-consciousness. The trouble with those is that we don't have full inferential control over them. We don't know what the inferential rules of those broadly logical expressions are. They're untamed, they're wild. They can do many things because of that we can't do with our artificial ones, but they don't have this feature that at least when we're using the artificial ones, we know what we mean in this sense of having inferential control over them. Now, it's something someone might want to do to capture the meanings of those ordinary expressions in the artificial terms. I myself despair of doing that. I think the job that's done by the natural language ones can't be done by one of our artificial ones. And I'm talking about the job that can be done by the artificial ones. I don't really see them as competing. I mean, I've said why I don't see the different formal ones as competing with one another, the different artificial ones. And I don't see them as competing to do the same job that's done by the natural language ones. But I know how to talk about the job done by the artificial ones in a way that I just don't see an analog of for those natural ones. So I prefer to see them as in different lines of work. And I have much less crisp things to say about what the job of work of the natural language ones is.
It's time for us to elaborate some other abilities that we have. I'd like to remind you that there's a reception to follow. You can get to it by going through the door, through the corridor at the back and up the stairs. And I would also like to thank again our speakers.